Hello, and welcome back to Immersion. This is part 2 on a series we are doing on the decision to be a parent or not in the modern world. In part 1, we examined this question through the lens of history and economics. In part 2, we're going to examine this more through sociology. And we're going to have a guest on very soon where we discuss the fact that while we have more options now, not everyone feels it's such an easy choice. But first, let's get into the topic of regret. Now, no conversation on time would be complete without the concept of regret. And regret and fear of regret, which is honestly more what we're going to be talking about, I realized that in some ways, a lot of the decisions around having kids is not even about if people want kids. It's framed through the lens of, will I regret it not having kids? And that is really interesting to me because out of the people that I've talked to or read about, most of the time, people will say, I was told I would regret it, but I haven't yet. I love how they say, I haven't yet, because no one wants to say, like, I never will. You never know. But there's a lot of fear-mongering out there. But the fear-mongering out there is not only around the age you should have a kid, but if you don't, what will happen? And people are also afraid of having kids and being a regretful parent, a topic that in the past, if we put back on our historical lens, would have probably been viewed as very taboo to talk about. But now, between the anonymity on Reddit and even probably certain Facebook groups, I believe you can be a little more anonymous in, regretful parents is a thing. Even some parents are coming out and writing certain books. There's even some research on this now. Between 7 and 14%, depending on location or what data you're looking at, of parents say that if they could go back, they would choose not to have children. And some people even wonder if that's a bit low because it still is a bit taboo to say you regret having kids. That's still millions of people. I was watching a video by Dr. Anna Uden. She goes by Psychology with Anna, and she was looking at a lot of this data. I don't remember the number she said, but there is a sentiment she said that really stuck out to me. And it is that the people who struggle with regret the most are often the ones who felt pressured into the choice. So isn't this ironic that people are told that they're going to regret not having children, so then they have kids, but then they're most often the ones that regret the choice. Now I'm extrapolating a little bit there. Not everyone that has kids and regrets it did that choice because they were told they would regret it if they didn't. That's extrapolating a bit. But I think it's interesting to do something because you're afraid of regretting the opposite way. It's like a fear-based living. It's a moving away from what you don't want versus a way of moving towards what you do want. Now, the reason there's so much speculation with regret is because this is one of, like we talked about, the only decisions that we can't take back. You move to a new city, you hate it, you can move away. You cut bangs, you hate it, you can grow them out. You have a kid, there is now a new kid on this planet that you are responsible for. And even if for some reason you don't end up raising that kid, they still exist. It is still a permanent decision that has been made. Of course, this is a philosophical idea, regret, so we need to turn to more philosophical thoughts in relation to it because no one person can tell you if you're going to regret this or not. A friend of mine that is in their 50s who doesn't have kids told me, look, when we made the decision, them and their partner, they said, we know we're going to regret this one day. So we're telling ourselves when we have sadness, when we have regret, that doesn't mean that we've made the wrong choice. It still might be the right choice for us. He said they actually have not regretted it over these decades. They're in their upper 50s. And I thought that was really profound and really beautiful because no matter what choice you make, there's going to be loneliness, there's going to be overwhelm, there's going to be moments of absolute stinging sadness. This is a really heavy topic because I was talking to someone before and they just hit some really personal parts of me. Like this touches on the most personal parts about what it is to be human. I was talking about some reasons I might not have kids, which like no shocker there. I wouldn't be filming this if I was sure I was going to have kids. They said, you'll never know intimacy to the depths that you can if you don't have kids. And that kind of stuff, this is why I think people get so worked up on either way, because that can really hurt. It's like you're saying in some ways that I'll never know the deepest love that I can know if I don't do this. And love is probably the deepest, most profound part of being a human. And some people feel like some of the reasons we're alive. And so that stung. That really stung. But that still doesn't mean that it's the right choice for me. And so I think what this person brings up is that, like, we need to give space for our feelings. And hat tip to School of Life for bringing up this quote in this context of Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher thought by many to be one of the first existentialists, brought up the point that no matter what decision you make, you will have regret, because there is no perfect path. If there was, you would know. Any hard decision is going to have pros and cons and opportunity costs, no matter which path you walk. There is no easy, perfect path. And knowing that releases us from the burden of trying to make the perfect decision. If there is no perfect path, we can't make the perfect decision. We can only make the best one for us with the information we have available. So here's just a small part of the quote: marry and you will regret it. Don't marry and you will also regret it. Marry or don't marry, you will regret it either way. And he goes on to list a bunch of other things. So I think Dr. Anna brought this up in her video, is that potentially some of the people that are regretful parents might have also been the same type of people to regret not having kids, because there might be, maybe due to, I don't think she said this, but I'm just speculating, maybe trait neuroticism or something. There's a certain population that might be more prone to regret in general, but through psychoanalysis, CBT, journaling, other treatments for certain populations, this could potentially be changed. So that's another avenue to explore, is if you feel really disappointed in your decision, you might have been disappointed in the other decision as well. The takeaway from this portion is that we will never not have a moment of sadness, but we're choosing the kind of sadness we're opting into, and we're trying to choose the path that has more of the moments that we want. All right, so another part of this topic is legacy. Some people want to have a child because they know it's a way that they can have a profound impact. To raise a child, to know that there will be people that remember them and the positive impacts that they had on their life. This does get pretty deep and existential and true to what it is to be a human. It's the kind of thoughts that could stop someone in their tracks if they're not thinking about it regularly, because often these thoughts are under the surface and then suddenly they hit us in certain moments. Now, I think that the urge to pass on one's DNA is just stronger for some people. I have talked to people about this. Clearly, this is something that I talk and think about quite a bit. I do not feel a strong urge to pass on my genes. I don't. My body is not yelling at me that way, but I know that for some people, they do feel that really intensely. I do believe, though, that we all can have a positive impact regardless of which path we walk down. And this kind of goes back to some of what we were talking about earlier, and thinking of our coaches, our teachers, our favorite authors, researchers, or artists, and just knowing that contribution and impact can come in many, many forms. Speaking of contribution, we are now going to hear from one of my dear friends and a writer, Madeline. She is going to speak on her experience living in a very different part of the country, being raised in a really different way than myself, because I realize in this episode, I'm speaking very freely about all of these choices we have. But a lot of people don't necessarily feel like they have choices, particularly if everyone they know around them is walking a very particular path. And so I'm really excited to have her on. Thank you for coming on the show, Madeline.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
So I'd love to first give the listeners a little bit more of your background in regards to what part of the country you're from, and just tell us your background in general so that we can understand your different perspective.
Absolutely. So I would say I predominantly lived in the Midwest, but I grew up as a military brat. So I'd say it was more like culturally that I was raised in the environment of military, Catholic, and homeschooled. And those are kind of distinctive subgroups, subcultures of their own.
I know that for you, it was quite the journey to make the choice to not have children. And the main reason I wanted to have you on is twofold. And I know we'll get into all of this. You're really well read on this subject. You also know more about history than me. And a lot of this episode pertains to history, women's rights, so many topics that I'm excited to get your thoughts on. But then also, I think during a lot of this episode, I talk about this very casually about how now we have all of these choices, and living in New York City, I just have such a different perspective of that. So how long did it take you to come to this decision? And feel free to tell any stories or struggles you had with that. And, was it a sudden light bulb or was it gradual?
I would say the first time I like recognized that I might not want that, I think it was somewhere between 7 and 8. And I just remember firmly declaring to my mom, like, look, I don't want to get married and I don't want to have kids. And I remember at that time, I was like, that's what I want. I don't know one took me seriously then. They're like, she's 7 or 8. Like, she doesn't want that responsibility at 8. That's normal. But I remember there was a show, it's Romancing the Stone. And like in the beginning of it, they have this woman, she's writing, she's in the zone, she has a place for herself. She's obviously child free. I mean, she's just sitting there in the zone, like in this huge night robe with like long socks on. And you see her like wrapping up this novel, crying to herself. She can't find tissue paper, toilet paper, or anything. She's just been so in the zone doing her thing. And I just remember knowing like, oh my God, that's what I want. I want a place to myself. I want to be able to get in the zone and have like the ability to forget things like toilet paper that are considered very maternal domestic items that you have to maintain for the progress of the household. And I wanted that luxury to be able to ignore all those things. And I knew that at 7 or 8. So, but I feel like I was raised in a culture where it was just considered something that happened. Like it kind of like there was no other, like the only way there was another path is if you were unfortunate enough to not be able to have them or never meet anyone. And so there were those two alternatives basically, or be a nun.
And you just painted such an amazingly clear picture because sometimes there are these beautifully clear moments, such as I want to be so lost in my writing that I forget toilet paper.
Yes.
And so, you had a quote that I think summarizes again, the differences between you and I, but it's also a really beautiful quote. And coming to this decision yourself, you said it to me over text in a voice text. Let me pull it out. And it won't be word for word. But you said, this is exciting because some people think that things like this are a universal truth. And I happen to disagree. So it's fun to explore and talk about and open a door that was always closed to me. And I think that's the thing I most want to hear about from you. Because even though I actually was raised in the South, I wasn't raised in the South. I don't know. The South has a lot of different feels to it. And I know that you've lived in the Midwest. You lived in a lot of different areas, but all of them are very different than like LA, Chicago, New York kind of a feel. And so the fact that that would feel like a universal truth to you, that like someone has to, it's something that, and I'm not just asking for myself, I'm asking for listeners that live in very progressive places who just don't even know, they can't even comprehend that. Can you describe what you mean by it was a universal truth and that door was closed to you and then opened?
Just constantly, even just raising the question or the idea, even in I just remember having constant reinforcement of the traditional norms of, you get married, you have kids. And if you want to do a little bit of other things, that's cool, but then family comes first. That was so much. I mean, and I was in homeschooling groups. So we were Catholic and homeschoolers, but there were other denominations and other faiths that were also homeschoolers and we'd all interact. Well, there'd often be young girls who they had to have their hair a certain length. They had to cover their hair if they went to church. They were not going to go to high school. They were homeschooled. They weren't going to get certain classes. They were going to get home ec, and they were going to court a boy and get married. So like I interacted with people whose ideas of who they were in the world and what they could go do were just very limited. And they were taught that that's just the way it was. And it was part of serving God in the world. And, if you think of God in a sense of like, this is love and this is how we love each other and stuff like that, then it's a very powerful and compelling message. And to say that you don't want to do that is not only turning your back on God for a person of faith, but turning away from love in Minnie's idea. And as a little girl, that's not okay in that culture. You know what I mean? To ever have any other priorities besides that. So, and they never, I mean, it is said, but it's said in a multitude of ways. And it's kind of a subtle message that's given in faith messages, culture messages. Plus, I was living on military bases where the women stayed home, often didn't have jobs because they were constantly following their husband's career. And the military culture is very, male centric. It's the spouse centric that's serving the force. I mean, that's kind of how it has to be to some degree. I'm sure they're trying to make more changes now, but I'm 40 now, so that's the generation I was being raised in. And so it was all around you. And I knew very early I did not want that path in particular. And the few women that I did see juggling, having a career, that they were the spouse that went out and the husband stayed home. I even babysat for a couple like that. They were a joy to be around. But I never once found myself thinking, oh, I want her life.
That's another interesting wrinkle is, okay, so the premise of this episode is whether one wants to be a parent or not, but specifically in the modern world. And so for some people, this decision is really not easy, but they know what they want. Because a decision can be difficult because of the people around you, and the decision can also be difficult because your internal compass is kind of conflicted on this. And it sounds like your internal compass was not conflicted. You were just in an environment where you were getting one message only. And so I'm going to throw two different directions you could take this question. And one is conscious versus subconscious thoughts, because I think when you're in that kind of environment, we don't even realize how much the subconscious messaging gets through.
Absolutely.
And then also there's the self, there's your close relationships, and then there's the culture is large. So so there's kind of three different spheres of influence, and all of this is impacting us. And I was talking to someone I know who's a bit older, and they said that they decided not to have kids. And they just said, look, whether you decide to have kids or not, you'll never know how much you've been influenced by the culture around you. And I think I just can't even imagine what that's like, particularly if you don't even have friends that aren't having children. Yeah, the reason why we're talking about this in the lens of being child-free, and this is something I think you've actually taught me, is when the norm is so heavily skewed as to you have children, this is where the conversation has to be. We don't have to have this conversation in the lens of, persuading people to have children, because that's the water, the air we breathe. Yeah. So I guess wherever you want to take any of these thoughts, I would just love to hear your opinion on any of that.
You talked about the self thing. I think obviously I was a little girl being raised in this culture. And so automatically, I knew what my compass was, but I was also someone who wanted to be good. I wanted to be loving. And if it's defined kind of in those terms of that's who you are when you're selfless and that's who you are when you give to others, you feel guilty a little bit for making that decision, oh, I'm bad. And so I remember I would go back to that decision and reevaluate periodically. At one point I was engaged. We were going to a Catholic church and I wanted to reevaluate, but it's also getting really into women's studies again. And I came across women like Barbara McClintock, who she was a scientist. She knew she really never wanted to be married. She knew what her life needed to look like for her to do the things she wanted to do and to be truly fulfilled. And I was like, oh my gosh, I was just drawn to all these women who'd made these choices. And I was like, light bulb, you're trying to force yourself in this box. But everything you're studying is a representation of what you actually are longing for. And I try to vocalize that to my family members and hear messages of oh, one, you don't want to be alone. And two, who's going to take care of you when you're old? My family was actually a little bit less of that than my friends. So I would say that in my family, at some point, I think they kind of accepted that as, I had repeatedly told them I wasn't going to have kids. They needed to rely on someone else for grandchildren. So, I was like, don't look to me for that. But I feel beyond that, there were friend groups. And as I was going into these points in my life where I was studying certain things, or I kind of was leaning in the direction of possible marriage and motherhood, and in a Catholic environment once again. And there was kind of validation of me moving in that direction from friend groups, from my boyfriend's family, from my family, even though there wasn't pressure towards exactly children. It was kind of just assumed by them that if I married, that would happen too. But gosh, I got lost a little bit there. But some of the other things that were happening were we were still kind of in a culture where women who remained childless were denigrated. So I was hearing that in cultural values as well, just externally, whether it was in our media, more conservative media that I was probably more exposed to than other regions might have been, and because of the family I was raised in. Um, Not just like the media also, but I was in school and there was a book I read and they were kind of debating like these women's lives who they'd gotten married and had children and they were trying to be creative, or they were just having children, not married just out of the question, and reflecting on how it impacted their creativity. And you could definitely see that there was a downfall, and they kept like trying to renegotiate like gender roles on like, well, if husbands did more, women can have more creative time. And I was like, why are we not even evaluating if for some people, if they want the creative life, maybe the best freedom they could have if they want is to remain child free. But that's because I was coming from a culture where it was seen as a priority. So the fact that no one was discussing this other option meant maybe no one's even thinking this is an option. Maybe it's just me thinking this is not an option. And I don't know. And then there's the other culture of there are women who want children and can't have children. So it's a very touchy topic to go into and discover who's made that choice so that you do have a mentor. You know what I mean?
Right, exactly. I think we were texting about this the other day, and even people that I know pretty well, until we're very close, the topic of kids doesn't even come up because you're right. You don't know their reasoning. And these days, because people, I think, have felt almost like these two camps kind of battle it out, it can get really intense. It can get really loaded, which is something that I'll talk about a little bit in the episode. But just to regroup us back, I did want to ask about, you talked about those mentors, and it seemed like you found this to be an option more from what you were reading about. And I think that you also just learn a lot from history in general. And I'm curious, between the role models you've looked at, between what you've read.
Well, I found like it very interesting historically. Like I would find mentors. There were some women who knew they didn't want to like get married and have kids, and they would like go into convents and they'd end up being able to have access to libraries and they'd be studying and they'd end up in leadership positions. So, and then there was Jane Austen, and her life story has often been told through the lens of like a spinster woman who maybe wasn't that attractive, couldn't find a husband, thus didn't have kids, but in the meantime wrote a couple books. You know what I mean? And now we look at her from a more feminist framework, and we actually look at her life choices. She kind of evaded marriage in her own ways. She did have opportunities if she really wanted it. And at one point she was engaged and then she called it off. And there's theories that she did that because she knew she was about to be published. So she thought was about to have her own income at least. And she didn't want something getting in the way of that happening. That's the theory. So, and then there are others like Edna Ferber who were definitely just child free on purpose. She mentioned, I was engaged a few times. I think I accidentally broke a couple hearts. It just wasn't for me. This is what I wanted to do. And, it's really interesting because her like niece wrote a biography about her. And just listening to this biography, it's all under this framework of this woman who's accomplished so much. She flew over to Germany after World War II to write about it because our newspapers here wanted her to review it and reflect on it. She was such a prolific writer, so important to our culture. Her books were made into movies. She was extremely wealthy. Like, she traveled the world constantly. She had friends everywhere. She was part of I think it's called, I don't even know how to pronounce it, the specific group out in New York that would get together writers. I think Algonquin. I don't know. Look up the name, find out the right pronunciation, but she was part of that. And this biography would describe her as if she lacked something in her life, literally because she wasn't married and didn't have kids. And this is written by her niece. And I just find that so terribly sad. In a way, I can't help but think, what jealous, spiteful beings. That she did everything a human being could do in the terms of success, adventure, fulfillment, friendships, community.
When was she active writing? What year was that?
She was writing, okay, she was born like 1889, maybe 1888, and she lived to like 1960 something. So she was writing between like 1925 to I think to 1960.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, because you bring up a really interesting point about how, I mean, it's not even that much later, but we look at these women through a more feminist lens. So we can look at someone like Jane Austen or any of these authors and kind of rewrite the narrative compared to the narrative that they were living in.
Yes, it is
Huh.
awesome.
Yeah, but it's like also just, we really feel for them. And I mean, it's hard to even comprehend. I think that's actually the whole point of this episode is it's hard to comprehend all of these thousands of years, how much change there's rapidly been lately. And of course, the pendulum swings back and forth in terms of freedoms for women. So it's not all linear and something to be really aware of. But I just really appreciate you coming on because I'm talking about all of these choices we have now. And I think it's really important to realize that in some areas, people, even in a country like the United States, people don't necessarily have those same choices available to them at this point. So I just thank you so much for bringing on your perspective.
And mine too, I feel like my mom wasn't super, you're going to go have 10 babies one day. Imagine being one of those girls who is raised in a family where she does love her mother. They have a great relationship. And mom's like, this is what's going to happen to you. She's homeschooled her entire life, only interacts with, and for the most part, close friendships, close relationships, people following the same path. Never even has the opportunity to go to a high school where she can get some scholarships, where she could make the choice to go to college on her own. And then courting a boy she's never even kissed and marrying him because that's what God has ordained. And really, kind of in a way, never having that many outlets for any other paths. And even with the media the way it is, just if you're kind of encapsulated in a way, in a certain way of thinking, how can you even begin to explore other possibilities?
That is so well said. I think that's a perfect place to end on. And thank you so much for speaking so candidly here.
Welcome.
And for coming on. Yeah, we'll talk separately in writer's group.
Yes, yes ma'am.
Welcome to the final segment of this episode. It is called The Shift, where we discuss potential reflections for after this, resources, experiments you could try. I always want the material we get into to feel potentially applicable if you want to dive in more after the episodes.
And in this case, a lot of these steps would apply whether you are trying to decide if you want to have kids or not, or if you've already decided.
If you want the two top resources that are most often cited in this space, they are two books written by two different therapists on this topic. So one is The Baby Decision, and that is by Merle Bombardieri, and that one is viewed as a bit more practical. But then there is another book by Denise Carlini and Ann Davidman. I actually have it right here. Motherhood Is It For Me? And that one has a lot of exercises. It is a little bit more emotions oriented. Some people might even describe it as a little bit more spiritual. I personally am planning to maybe not do every single exercise or read every single page of both books. I think it can be a lot. Most people might do one of them, but I would like to expose myself to the work of both of these women, see if one resonates, and probably work through the entirety of one of those books. There are also books that might help if you're on the fence about parenting itself. One of my friends who is a mother really spoke highly of the book Hunt, Gather, Parent. And that is about how Indigenous cultures parent differently than parents from Western cultures. And I think that that would connect really well to this topic and something that we can explore in part 3, which I will go into at the end because that's something that I'll release down the line. It's not going to come out right after this. I want to allow some space for contemplation, discussions with my partner, research, and just time for this topic to breathe. But in the meantime, I think these are some resources that you could look into. Definitely those first two books that I mentioned and other resources by those same two therapists. They have websites, articles, I believe some even have courses. So you can find what resonates. And some people will even go through these exercises in a group of other women trying to decide. And just so that you have something practical from one of these books, Ann Davidman talks a lot about the idea of, for 1 week, convince yourself, make the decision that you have decided to have kids. And then another week, you'll do the same exercise as if you don't have kids. And then you live as if. Again, I haven't read the book yet, but I was even just imagining doing that. And if I was thinking that I was going to have kids, I would be looking at preschools in my area, visualizing what it would be like to make breakfast in the morning for the child as well. And it just really puts you in the state of what would it be like to have already decided? And that can be really transformational. But that's just one exercise of many that she has. And she also talks about separating the decision of if you want to be a parent or not from the decision of if you're going to be a parent or not, because those are separate things. Someone might decide, for instance, that they want to be a parent, but then they might find out later that they're not able to, or the financial pressures might make them decide that they're not going to, like we discussed. But first, weighing all of that at the same time can be way too much. So she recommends first going through this journey to decide if you want kids or not. And then later you can decide if you're actually going to be a parent. I found that a really insightful distinction that is not often talked about. Another step is supporting women in both paths. I've talked a lot here about supporting women who maybe choose a less conventional path due to modern complexities or just because it just doesn't feel right for them to have a child. But how do we also support women that choose to have a child and those families, in particular lower and middle class families? This can mean researching policies and officials before elections to understand who you are putting in office, because we need officials that support families. And this doesn't just mean maternal leave. It's also about healthcare. So supporting women also means supporting women that do choose to be mothers, and hopefully them having enough resources to get their needs met and their families' needs met. And a lot of that also just benefits the middle and lower class in general, even people that choose not to have kids. It's just about a society where needs are met. Okay. Another step is discussing fertility with your doctor. That's what I was attempting to do with my gynecologist from that story from the beginning, but I don't think he fully understood. And this brings up the point that while you can discuss this with your gynecologist, if you have more specific needs, like wanting to know about your reproductive window right now, or if you have a hard time getting pregnant, a reproductive endocrinologist is someone who has further training on these needs for women and might be who you need to talk to. Or you can look at resources online by one of these professionals. I'll link a podcast down below with a reproductive endocrinologist just to give you a jumping off point if you're interested. One thing you will often hear about is to get your AMH tested to see how many eggs you might have left. But it's not always so straightforward. Not only does it fluctuate some months, but also this doesn't tell you the quality of your eggs. It only points to the quantity. So there's a lot more to the story, but talking to a doctor is the first step. This step is less of something that you can check off on your to-do list and something that we need to just allow space for in our life. And it is grieving the path that we were not able to take. So whether you were unable to have kids and you wanted them, whether you became a parent and it was not part of your plan, whether you had a really hard choice and this was something you're basically 50-50 on, so you knew you were giving up a lot by not taking the other path that you really wanted to. I don't even truly have the words here to... There aren't words that can be supremely comforting here. There isn't a simple solution, but we can give ourselves space to grieve. We can be there for each other. And my partner helped me realize this when we sat down to have a discussion recently. I had been approaching this topic very much in my head. I mean, you can probably pick that up with the whole long list I had written out. And I was going over this with him, and he was patiently listening to my different thoughts. And I wanted to hear his, but after talking through the possibility that we might not have kids, we both realized that we might, but there's a chance we might not. I think it was the first time that it really hit him that that was a potential reality. Even though he's very much 50-50 on this subject, I just don't think he had visualized it. And he got quiet, and he looked a bit sad. And then I asked, oh, does this mean you want kids? And he said, no, not necessarily. But he was, I think, coming to terms with closing that door potentially and grieving in a way. And then we sat there together and grieved that door potentially closing down the line. Now, this might happen in a larger way when a couple officially closes that door. We're still not sure. But this was a great lesson to bring this into my heart and feelings versus approaching it as a purely analytical topic, which I think that we can do when something feels so big. It can feel a little bit easier to compartmentalize it. But this is one reason that Anne Davidman's book is so popular, because she really teaches people how to get into their feelings, being a therapist on this topic. We can have compassion for ourselves and others because it is such a difficult, personal, intimate, life-changing choice, and for many, not a choice. So simply acknowledging that here. Another step is finding community, both in the sense of finding community for people that are similar to you in a similar situation, for instance, a child-free group or a parents group, but then also surrounding ourselves in communities that are different from us. For instance, I think a lot of people that don't have kids do appreciate being aunts or uncles or getting to know their friends' kids. I also think that it helps us see from more perspectives to have friends of various ages and different life circumstances. And I know that it helps me, so going back to the political note, it just helps me understand when I try to stay informed to see things through the lens of people that are really different than myself. And I also just think we're happier as a society. Go back to, living in villages. And I think we had people that were much older, people that were much younger around us. And I think that it led to a lot of happiness. So it's not even just about being informed. This is just a personal take there. I guess a lot of this is personal takes mixed in with some research and things I've heard. But that's something that came to me. And within this, talking to people about this, for so long, people felt like they couldn't talk about it. I think it's getting more common now, hence podcasts about it. It might include talking to your therapist as well as you weigh this decision if that's something that you're doing. Speaking of talking to people about it, within your relationship, as you're weighing this question, I think often we're weighing, do I want a baby? And we're not necessarily asking, what kind of a relationship do I want? It can be worth reading about how this shapes one's relationship. For instance, something that I was seeing is often relationships do change. Relationship satisfaction dips in the initial stages, but then it goes back up after having a child. And there is a sense of shared mission that can bond people. So it goes from doing life face to face and maybe intimate connections over dinner and deep conversations and some of the initial things that bonded you to now having a new thing that bonds you. I have seen certain couples, believe it or not, that kept some of the magic that they had initially without kids because there isn't the same feeling of overwork and burden in a certain way. But then some of the people I know that have kids, they have a different type of bond from having gone through this experience together. And these are big generalizations. This is not the case for everyone. Of course, some people drift apart when they don't have kids, or some people have kids and for many different reasons could end up getting divorced. So none of this is to say that you're ensured a healthy relationship either way. A lot of it does go back to what we're talking about, what happens after the decision, not which decision you make. But it is something interesting to think about, is like, how is having kids going to impact your relationship is another conversation to have. That's another space for a lot of compassion for ourselves and others, because it is so painful when one person wants one thing and another person wants another in this area, because either one person is very unhappy with their decision and compromising, or the couple breaks up. It's, again, basically the biggest topic or decision in the space of a relationship. And the reason why I keep saying over and over again, space for compassion for ourselves and others, is because I started to notice an us versus them aspect, where people that have kids could get really judgmental about people that aren't having kids. People that don't have kids feel really judged, so then they push back really violently against the people that are having kids. And then both groups are kind of putting up their hands like, whoa, hey now. And it's because as we keep going into, it's this really personal question that impacts all of your life. So if someone feels like the best decision they ever had was having kids, then someone choosing to opt out of that could feel really jarring to them or confusing. And if someone doesn't want kids, they might feel like their whole life, not only their family, their friends, society, the government, everybody is pressuring them to have a kid. People around them are having kids, so even when it's unspoken, it's just the norm. So there's this clash on this, like, again, the most important, probably personal decision you can ever make. And I hope that more of us can have really open conversations about it, because I think that's how we have more people that are happy with their decisions versus regret either way, is being able to air it out. I'll get to one last thought to close and then a couple footnotes. And it's what we talked about earlier. The idea of having a full life. What a full life means to you means something so different compared to someone else. Someone that I know that has children basically describes if their life was a sandwich, the meat of that sandwich is having kids and being a mom. Life wouldn't feel complete without that. But then someone else I know talks about really wanting and enjoying living a full life. And for them, they've equated that full life to mean diving into every work opportunity that they can and saying yes to it, going to museums or plays on the weekend, flying to Barcelona for a week in the spring. And for them, they always say that saying yes is what brings them joy in life, being able to soak in all that life has to offer. And both of these people define that really differently. And both of them are really happy with their choice. Probably the most important thing you could do is journaling about what a full life means to you. And maybe you're like me, where you realize that you could have a full life either way. And even though it doesn't necessarily give you instant clarity as to which path is right, you know that you can be happy and whole and stand in your decision afterwards. Because for me, that is community, contribution to causes I care about, art, and then just having a lot of certain parts of my life, like certain needs met, feeling like I'm taking care of my health and my finances, and all of that to me is a good life. And I don't know if I'm going to have kids or not. And I'm okay with that. And people tell me that the window is not forever. And I acknowledge that. I don't need to hear it again. And it's a bit irritating because women are told that so much that it is not new information. And it feels like someone telling me that I'm really behind on a project that I already know that I'm behind on, but I don't know if I want to take that project on. So that choice is up to me. And it's up to you. And of course, there are women that have been in really bad situations where that choice was not up to them. And that is something else that we can think about as a part of this. That brings us to the footnotes, is that declining birth rates mean certain things for countries, maybe their economy, their military. So there's a vested interest for certain countries to not have their birth rates go down. Those conversations about different impacts are for another day or for different people, but this is also about the personal choices that people and women have. And so when countries and states start to infringe on the personal choice, that is when these things are intimately linked and something really important to talk about, care about, and to dive deeper in. The very last point here is an existential one. Some people feel that there is a greater purpose to carrying on the human race. And when the population size of planet Earth was much lower, that's probably something that our ancestors, whether it was conscious or unconscious, were carrying with them, is the survival of our species. But with population having more than quadrupled in the last century, from 2 billion to over 8 billion, I personally do not feel responsible for carrying on the human race and making sure that there's enough people. I think that there's enough people on that mission. And none of this is to say that you can't have kids, because I think that a lot of people can have an amazing impact through having a kid or not, or someone might decide that having an impact is not why they're here. So at the end of these 2 dives into this subject, we will hold off on doing a part 3 until down the line for 2 reasons. One reason is that I want to hear from you. I want to hear your thoughts on this topic. There are so many different viewpoints, particularly if you have children, if you're weighing this yourself, if you've decided you definitely don't want them, but maybe that was a difficult choice for certain reasons, or maybe not. I just would love to hear from you. This is a topic that I think is better served in conversation. So you can call in or write into the show, and I will have those links down below for you. And then I also want to allow some time and space before regrouping to do a part 3, because I want to work through some of these books and work through this decision some myself a bit more before coming back to it. You heard quite a bit about my personal story throughout this, but if you want to hear more about that really extensive pro list that I mentioned earlier, or more of maybe what I discussed with my therapist if it doesn't get too personal, what economists have to say about intensive parenting. There's a lot more we could get into. One more thing I will link below in the meantime is an article by Vox about how millennial women have learned to dread motherhood specifically through messaging that they're getting about how difficult it will be. And that's something we could get into in part 3, but I did have to sort of stop myself because there's so much that could be said on this topic. In fact, if you're looking for more of this kind of content, there's actually a whole podcast just on this, the decision to be a parent or not. So I'm going to link her podcast down below because my podcast normally gets into very different topics, all explored through a psychological and philosophical lens. But apart from this 3-part deep dive, it's not something we talk a ton about. So I'll link that down below as well in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here for both parts, and see you next week on a different topic.